Most of you remember Lorraine Wilbur as the director of the Family Arts and Crafts Department at the Ohio State Fair during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Her husband was a principal at Bexley City Schools, and one of his kindergarten teachers used to be the director of the Family Arts and Crafts. But when that teacher transferred out of the district, her sister, who was on the fair commission at the time, talked Mrs. Wilbur into taking over, by telling Mrs. Wilbur there was nothing to it. Nothing to it? The home canned goods category alone had 46 different classes. Mrs. Wilbur said her first year wasn't so bad, though. There were only 3 judges, and the fair was only 10 days long. But by the early 80s, it had become a 17-day fair with more than 60 different judges. But let's let some of the participants tell you a little more about what it was like to enter their creations in the Family Arts and Crafts Department at the Ohio State Fair.
I started entering the Ohio State Fair when I was 14 years old, in the youth gardens at the Road Center. For 8 years, I exhibited vegetables and potted plants. Then, when I moved to the Agriculture and Horticulture building in my early 20s, I met Mary Ann Winfield, who encouraged me to start entering in the Family Arts and Crafts Department. That first year, in 1980, I only entered a few antiques, but the next year, I started entering the men's culinary classes, and I won first place for the 7C salad dressing contest. I remember Lorraine Wilbur, who had been a judge for more than 20 years at that point, saying to me, "I can't believe a man won the contest." From then on, I had fair fever. I have more than 2,500 ribbons in my collection now, and I was inducted into the Ohio State Fair Hall of Fame in 2006 as an exhibitor and supporter of the Family Arts and Crafts. I've been working in the Arts and Crafts building since 2002 as a full-time chef, and I do daily demonstrations during the run of the fair. Oh, and Marianne and I are still good friends.
My love affair with the Ohio State Fair began in my preschool years when I attended the fair with my parents and grandparents. Then, in the summer of 1955, I began entering the junior division as a Camp Fire girl, and I continued to enter through my senior year of high school. I represented Camp Fire on the Junior Fair Board in 1960 and 1961, and I still have my framed certificate of appointment signed by the governor hanging in my sewing room. I worked in the State Fair entry office in 1962, and I was a finalist for the Ohio State Fair Queen that same year. The first year I entered the Family Arts and Crafts Department, I won Best in Show for candies. But then, one year, I got held up in traffic, and Lorraine Wilbur disqualified me for being 30 minutes late. So I just sat in my car and ate my entry. When my children were old enough to walk down the runway, I began entering clothing for them. Back then, style shows could have as many as 16 entries in each class, and I remember winning first place one year for a back-to-school outfit for our son, Josh. He stood on the stage next to 14 little girls in smocked dresses. Best first place ever. My most memorable entries include wedding garments for my daughter's wedding, the year I finally won first place in the Spam category, although I was disqualified one year for making spumoni ice cream. And then the years I won Best in Show for cooking with Ohio wines and won a trip to New York for the Seattle's Best Coffee competition. But more than anything, what's most special and memorable are all of the friendships I've made throughout the years, and the fact that I get to rekindle those friendships every year at the Ohio State Fair.
Our mother, Helen Joseph, was an intense, dedicated competitor in the baked goods category at the Ohio State Fair during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. She was a leader in the Ross County 4-H in the 30s and 40s, and she graduated from The Ohio State University in 1942 with a degree in home economics. She put her knowledge and skills to work, raising a farm family of us 8 children. Creating baked goods was more a necessity than a hobby. That prize money was carefully counted and counted upon. Yeast breads and quick breads were her specialty, and she would enter more than a dozen categories every year. She made banana breads, nut breads, white and whole wheat breads, yeast rolls, sweet rolls, angel food cakes, Swedish tea rings, and much more. Every August, she filled our farmhouse with the aromas of cinnamon, overripe bananas, fermenting yeast, and vanilla. She would make multiple batches and select only the finest-looking loaves for entry. Just prior to kneading some wheat rolls one year, Mom discovered she'd omitted the yeast. so she simply kneaded the yeast into the batch, baked the rolls, and won the class. Of course, the products had to be presented intact, so a loaf couldn't be cut open for pre-inspection. I'm sure most contestants held their breath momentarily while watching the judge's knife slice into their loaf, hoping a large air hole wouldn't be exposed. Since the statute of limitations has expired, it can probably be revealed that a few loaves may have been frozen, then thawed just before delivery to the fair. One year, the freezer died right around fair time, causing more than a little anxiety and some last-minute remaking of a few entries. The products were then carefully placed in cardboard boxes and into the station wagon for delivery to the fairgrounds, more often than not for an arrival just in time for the deadline.
Mrs. Joseph would be happy to know that Mrs. Wilbur cannot retroactively disqualify her. Everyone knows how long and hard these participants worked on their creations, usually year-round. These were hard-working women, and a few gentlemen too, most of whom studied home economics and were proud homemakers. Let's have Mrs. Parker tell you a little more about that.
It was in 1969, and I entered under the name as Mrs. William E. Parker, and that is what we did back then. We used our married names because we were homemakers and very proud of it. I had a very successful year. My first year, I only entered 12 to 15 items and won the Rosette for the Archway Grand Award for Homestyle Cookies in 1971. Well, I found out that the Grand Award was a 25 cubic foot Westinghouse side-by-side state-of-the-art refrigerator. In 71, well, right after 70, I started compiling recipes, testing them, getting patterns for sewing and the style show, arts and crafts. So I worked the whole year with coordinating fabric and tweaking recipes, and I entered 79 categories. Everything basically except quilting and canning. And at the end of the show, after all the points were counted, the refrigerator was mine. Don't remember what year that was. I think it was 70, maybe, that I won the blue ribbon for apple pie. And Max and Irma's at that time was not paying anything extra for the award, but they did a couple of years later, and then also the pies and the first place items were auctioned to different restaurants or whoever wanted to buy them in town. And Max and Irma's wanted me to show one of their chefs how to make apple pie. So I went to the restaurant in German Village and tried. A young kid, not adept at making pie crust, but at least they got my recipe, and I always told them later on that didn't charge them anything for it, but that was my fault. But I should have charged them a penny a slice and probably would have made a lot of money off of them, but that's okay.
My name is Sarah DeBoer, and my mom, Maren DeBoer, entered the Ohio State Fair in the Family Arts and Crafts Department for 40 years, from 1963 until 2003. She thrived during an era of belt-tightening do-it-yourselfers who sought to contradict the stereotypical housewife label. The Ohio State Fair proved to be the perfect arena for her competition in the creative arts. She submitted entries in the culinary arts, sewing, crafts, and quilts, and the parade of household appliances delivered to my mom's home throughout the years reflected an impressive level of achievement. She was definitely no ordinary housewife. In 2004, she sewed all 420 of her ribbons from the fair into one large display piece and wrote the following dedication. Made by Maren DeBoer and dedicated to my beloved husband of 49 years, Lee DeBoer. During each of those years, Lee encouraged me in all my endeavors. He died on August 1st, 2003, and is dearly missed. My mom passed away in 2008. She, too, is dearly missed.
So many participants succeeded in part with the help of their spouses. Or perhaps they met their future spouses at the Ohio State Fair. Or maybe even entered categories side by side as husband and wife duos. Take Mr. and Mrs. Van Fossen, for example.
My husband Leslie and I competed every year in the Ohio State Fair for more than 30 years. We first started entering in the 1950s, and we have more than 100 ribbons for baking, sewing, and latch hook. I traveled many miles from our family's farm home near Springfield, Ohio, to compete on Pie Day. I would bake 10 to 15 different fruit pies in one day to take to the fair, and then it was always a fun day for the family when I returned home, and everyone could taste their favorite pies. In 1981, I was the champion cherry pie winner, and my pie went on to enter the Blue Ribbon auction in the senior division. Pew Amusements ended up purchasing my cherry pie recipe for $525. My husband Leslie entered many items in the Family Arts and Crafts department too, everything from baked goods to latch hooks. He won prizes for his hickory nut cake, which he made from scratch, and I mean from scratch, starting with gathering hickory nuts, shelling hickory nuts, canning hickory nuts, and eventually baking the hickory nut cakes. In 1986, he won first prize for his latch hook of the Lord's Supper. Leslie and I were married for 74 years. He passed away in 2009 at the age of 95, and I will be celebrating my 100th birthday on September 18th this year.
The Ohio State Fair is a special place for me. My mother took me to my first Ohio State Fair when I was just an infant, and I have attended the fair every year except for the years when it was closed during World War II. I met my husband at the State Fair Beef Barn for our first date, and we just celebrated our 55th anniversary this year. My husband and our two sons were very active in 4-H and FFA. Our family showed in lamb, beef, hog, floral, and showmanship classes for more than 20 years, winning multiple championships along the way. But my most recent participation has been as a judge. I started judging at the Ohio State Fair in 1999, and I have judged 33 different creative arts competitions in the past 18 years. I'm a retired educator with more than 35 years' experience in home economics and counseling. I was a 4-H advisor for more than 15 years, and I'm currently the owner and CEO of Young's Evergreen Nursery and work as a consultant in the floral industry.
If there's a theme emerging here, it's that the Ohio State Fair is all about family. It's in the name, Family Arts and Crafts Department. Sometimes that might be the family you were given. Other times that might mean your chosen family, your community, and the incredible friendships you've maintained throughout the years. For many participants, those friendships began right here at the Ohio State Fair.
My friend Lois Thiergartner and I began entering the children's fashion shows in 1983 with our two oldest daughters. We had learned to do English smocking and loved to sew for our girls. Lois talked me into entering the fair with her, even though neither of us had any experience with competitions. We noticed one of our fellow competitors, Lynn Snyder, also did smocked outfits for her daughters. Our friendship blossomed over the next few years of fair participation. Since our children were so close in age, we began to arrange potlucks at each other's homes and spent many memorable times together as our kids grew up. In 1986, Lynn and I gave birth to our sons only 3 weeks apart. By 1989, even our boys were modeling at the fair. We would always picnic together outside the Arts and Crafts building, and we used wagons to tour the fairgrounds. By the early 1990s, our 6 girls were competing with their own 4-H sewing and cooking projects and winning awards. Us moms, however, had graduated to the open class sewing competitions, as our boys were not as eager to be models as their sisters had been. All of us won many awards throughout the years, but our biggest treasure has been the enduring friendship we've maintained to this day. Our children are now married, and we original seamstresses are now grandparents. And it all began those many years ago at the Ohio State Fair in the Arts and Crafts building.
My first entry at the Arts and Crafts Building at the Ohio State Fair was an oatmeal cookie in 1965. My entries at the fair were culinary, sewing, style shows, food preservation, and special days, which included days like the wine contest, special desserts, sauerkraut day, tomato juice day, spam day, and various days. My friends and neighbors looked forward to the day of pie competition. In one day, I baked 18 varieties of fruit and cream pies. The neighbors knew that after a slice of each pie was judged, I would be bringing the rest of the pie home. That night, our family would host what would later become known as Pie Day Party. In 1990, after the pie party, although I was exhausted, I was faced with baking one last pie for the American Pie celebration the following day, a cherry pie. That pie won the Ohio contest, which allowed my husband Chuck and I to attend the national convention in New Orleans the following spring. After 3 days of touring the city with 49 other contestants, we were given the challenge to bake our pies at the convention center. 10 judges selected my Ohio Sour Cherry Pie as the national winner, which carried with it prizes that included all new KitchenAid appliances, the entire Longaberger basket collection, and a feature in the Good Housekeeping magazine. When we first started entering the fair, we were not acquainted with others, but as we entered each year, we met more and more people, which made the fair more fun and interesting because everyone had a certain story and background, so we were always telling our stories and sharing, asking about others, and a lot of friendships have developed over the years. In 1970, I met Patty Parker, and we were in the same contest. We were in the beef contest, where she actually got first and I got second. And we have remained friends. And last year, when we talked on the telephone, we decided it was time to preserve the legacy of those people who had been part of the Arts and Crafts Building from our era and even earlier to now.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorgel. You and Mrs. Parker have worked tirelessly and diligently to collect information from past participants. Most of you probably remember Mrs. Parker's apple pie or Mrs. Gorgel's cherry pie. But what you might not realize is just how much work went into getting ready for all of these contestants to submit their entries. Do that one again.
I began working for the Ohio State Fair in 1962. For some of us, like me, we were there for a summer job, and we started in July, if I recall. My job was to use the state's old, discarded typewriters to record all of the entry forms that were sent in, be it for artwork, clothing, food, flowers, or even livestock. And we were not allowed to use whiteout. All of the animals, for example, had to be listed with their names and registration numbers, as well as the names and registration numbers of their sires and dames, and the names and addresses of their owners. Those registration numbers were very long. We had to put headings on all the pages, and the entry books required an extra long carriage. We began posting entries as soon as they came in, and as we entered the information, each entry was given an entry number to be used for judging and awarding prizes. When it came time for the judging, these huge books went to the show to record the placements, and then the books were returned to us for awarding prize money. We had lengthy forms to complete for the state auditor, and our accounting had to be exact, down to the penny. I worked for the Ohio State Fair until 1967, when I got a phone call that we were about to adopt our first child. I decided to leave the fair as an employee, but I returned in 1977 as a competitor. We had 4 children at that point, and all 4 of them modeled the clothes I had sewn for them. They were 10, 9, 7, and 3, and still to this day, they have great memories of their experience at the Ohio State Fair, as do I.
I worked for the Ohio State Fair for 32 years. first as a secretary and eventually becoming the director of special events, arts, and junior fair division. My days were busy year-round. There's so much planning to do for a fair. We worked all year for those then 17 days, and finding talent and activities and competition classes was never-ending. I helped Lorraine Wilbur put together the handbook for the Arts and Crafts Department. After she retired, I worked with the other directors to get ideas and suggest classes. I discussed the department with other state fairs and asked for their handbooks to help get ideas too. In 1998, I earned my credentials as a certified fair executive. I was also involved with the International Association of Fairs and Expositions, which gave me great access to other fairs and an opportunity to learn what to do and, well, sometimes what not to do. Perhaps our biggest mistake happened when a sponsor asked us to add a sauerkraut competition. Now, don't get me wrong, all of the exhibitors did a great job coming up with recipes, but our mistake was letting them keep their creations in the building overnight. When one of the directors arrived the next morning, the place smelled awful. It took a number of fans and a number of hours before anyone could stand being in the space. Obviously, we did not repeat that cooking contest. When we did a cookbook for the Ohio State Fair, it was a labor of love, but so worth it. I'm not sure what happened to the unsold cookbooks after I retired in 2003, but I know I have my copy.
Speaking of recipes, let's hear from a few participants about which recipes were their favorites.
My name is Barbara Daisy Bart-Shunkin, and I am Grace Stout's niece. She was born November 22, 1908, near Duval, Ohio, and lived most of her life in northern Pickaway County. Grace exhibited her canned fruits and vegetables, baked goods, fresh vegetables, and flowers at the Ohio State Fair, the Pickaway County Fair, the Circleville Pumpkin Show, and various festivals in Pickaway County. On November 2, 1988, the Columbus Dispatch wrote an article about her winning at the Ohio State Fair in the food section and included her picture with her blue ribbon quick bread as she sat on a glider swing on her front porch. She brought home 35 ribbons from the Ohio State Fair that summer that included 2 grand prize awards for quick breads and canned fruit. Some of her prize recipes were printed in the article as well. She began entering the State Fair contest in 1958 and excelled in cakes, pies, and canned goods. She fired up her coal and wood stove to bake the special meringue pies. Her story is in a glass case featuring her baking at Asheville's Small Town Museum. Grace was honored to have her apple crumb pie recipe printed in America's Best Recipes.
One of my favorite competitions was the cookie jar competition. It was originally known as the Ohio Governor's Cookie Jar and evolved into the Ohio State Fair Cookie Jar Competition. I entered the competition for 10 years. My most favorite jar was a carousel. This particular jar required 3 trips to Mansfield, where there's a wonderful carousel museum and an actual carousel in the middle of town. As a competitor in tablescaping, I entered both the card table and buffet table competitions, which are no longer in existence. Some of my favorite card tables were Dining In, representing a Marine Corps tradition, and a table resembling a child's building block. My most favorite buffet tables were my South High School's 50-year reunion, my husband and I's 50th wedding anniversary, and a teacher appreciation luncheon where I used pool noodles to create the look of number 2 pencils around the legs of the table itself. That one was inspired by a school on the hilltop that our church adopted and took treats to the teachers each month and then held a luncheon for them at the end of the year. I also competed in the Heart Healthy Recipes category at the Ohio State Fair and won Best of Show for my tropical mango cake recipe. I started with a box cake and then added things and played around with it. I tried applesauce, but that wasn't it. So I just kept trying until I liked it. And the winning recipe used baby food. I used strained pears instead of vegetable oil. I think it's important to learn to cook and eat this way. you'll live longer.
That is great advice. But there are just so many delicious cookies and candies and pies and cakes and incredible desserts year after year at the Ohio State Fair. Just ask those 60-plus judges. And we haven't even mentioned the dairy building or the butter cow yet. Most of you have more than a few memories from the Ohio State Fair, and most of you have probably entered more than a few items in the Family Arts and Crafts Department. But for those of you who haven't, or for those of you who are thinking about entering but aren't quite sure, let's talk to a few of the most notable Hall of Fame inductees to see what they have to say about the Ohio State Fair, and what advice they might be able to give would-be participants.
As a tomboy growing up on a farm near Crestline, Ohio, it never really occurred to me that cooking could be interesting or fun until I began studying my Girl Scout handbook. Those older cookbooks contained a wealth of information. No matter how badly my cooking turned out, it always received praise from my father. I can still recall several recipes, such as an outdoor cooking recipe for Comac stew with eggs, tomatoes, onions, and green pepper. There were 8 women in my mother's family. At family gatherings, I think each one secretly hoped her cake or dessert would be the favorite. This probably spurred my interest in baking. My formal training for teaching home economics benefited this teacher as much as it did my students. World War II rationing had limited the variety of foods that could be prepared, but you can bet the home economics laboratory kitchen was mobbed when the aroma of bread baking permeated the building. Being a full-time mother and homemaker, it changes your perspective on a lot of things, but one can always set challenges and goals for oneself. For me, this involved daring to bake things as well or better than other competitors at the Ohio State Fair. My first entry, which was in the mid-1950s, was an angel food cake, which won a blue ribbon. In the 1960s, my entry of fancy-shaped rolls, which were barely finished baking in time to be entered, won the Fleischmann's Yeast Award for Best in Show for all yeast bread entries. The prizes consisted of a diamond-centered gold ribbon pin by Tiffany, a trip to New York City to make a yeast commercial, and ads in several magazines. My desire to compete grew, and boxes of ribbons began to accumulate over the years in categories such as yeast bread and rolls, quick breads, cakes, pies, cookies, candies, canned goods, jellies and jams, and dehydrated foods, as well as sewing, antiquing, and mentoring junior fair entrants. In the 1990s, various companies sponsored special event days. I won first prize for Hershey's Greatest Cocoa Cake, first prize for Land O'Lakes Light Sour Cream Coffee Cake, grand prize for Ohio Wine's Main Dish, second prize for Nestle's Cake, first and second prizes for Spam, and second prize for soy desserts. The basic guidelines I learned in college are still true. Choose a reliable recipe, use good ingredients, and measure accurately. Your product must have eye appeal, taste good, and be typical in texture of the product.
My mother taught me to sew when I was 4.5 years old. She would cut out squares and triangles for me, and I sewed 4 of the triangles onto a square to make a larger square. Mother titled my design Squares and Corners, and I loved sewing those little patches together. This was the early 1930s, but those patches didn't become a full quilt until 1968. I first entered the Ohio State Fair in 1975. Lorraine Wilbur asked me to demonstrate hand quilting during the fair, and in 1988, she established the All-Ohio Quilt Show, which was separate from the fair entries. She then asked me to find some of my fellow members of the Columbus Metropolitan Quilters Guild to do demonstrations. So I organized teams of 2 to work in 4-hour shifts. Later in 2001, I was inducted into the Ohio State Fair Hall of Fame. I'm now 91 years old and I still quilt. To date, I have made about 400 quilts of various sizes. The Ohio History Center asked me to donate one of my quilts, Birds in Full View, and the American Quilt Society purchased one of my quilts, Lancaster County Rose, for the National Quilt Museum.
If one is computer savvy, they can type in my name and see some of my work. I've won hundreds of ribbons over the years, but my favorite prize was winning a Caribbean cruise in 1982 for a quilt I entered into the Stearns and Foster Mountain Mist contest.
Thank you, Mrs. Cahill and Mrs. Goodrich. Now what are you waiting for? If you're watching this on YouTube, you're pretty computer savvy, right? So as soon as you're done Googling Mrs. Goodrich, go learn how to enter your work into the Family Arts and Crafts Department for next year's Ohio State Fair.